Imagine a weapon so dangerous that the people who built it erased the memory of building it. Not destroyed it, not buried it, erased the knowledge that it had ever existed, from the records, from the survivors, from the minds of the gods themselves. In the grim darkness of the far future, there is a kind of human the Imperium fears more than any xenos and hunts more carefully than any heretic. The blank, the pariah, the null, a person the warp can't feel. Stand next to one and your skin crawls, your prayers go unanswered, your demons go blind. Now imagine that one of the 20 suns the Emperor forged to conquer the galaxy was born one. Not a warrior who fought chaos, a warrior chaos couldn't see. A Primarch the Ruinous Powers couldn't touch, couldn't tempt, couldn't even perceive, walking the galaxy at the head of 100,000 Astartes, a hole in the warp shaped like a god. The Emperor didn't lose the Second Legion, he hid it, because the moment the Chaos Gods learned what he had made, they would have spent the rest of the crusade trying to unmake it. And the only way to keep a secret from a god who sees all of time is to make sure no one alive remembers it was ever true. Every living being in the Warhammer universe exists twice. There is the material world, flesh, stone, the weight of power armor against a deck plate, and there is the warp, the psychic dimension underlying all of reality. Your soul casts a reflection in the immaterium whether you want it to or not. Psychers burn there like signal fires. Ordinary humans flicker like candles. Both are readable. Both are reachable. Both are vulnerable. The pariah gene changes that equation entirely. Blanks, also called pariahs, nulls, or untouchables, carry a mutation that produces what the lexicanum describes as a negative presence in the warp that drains its energies toward their void-like soul. Where every other being emits a psychic signal, a blank generates a psychic drain, an absence so aggressive it pulls the medium around it inward. The effect is absolute, no warp presence, no warp reflection, and no mechanism by which the standard tools of the immaterium, sorcery, demonic possession, psychic manipulation, can find purchase. That drain radiates outward as an aversion field. Stand within range of a sufficiently powerful blank, and your hindbrain registers something wrong. Not intellectually wrong, pre-rationally wrong, the way an animal registers a predator before it has resolved what it is seeing. The response documented across the lore is consistent. Nausea, irrational hatred, an urge to flee or to attack that can't be reasoned away because it never originated in reason. People who know they are standing next to a blank still want to harm them. The knowledge helps nothing. The aversion doesn't come from opinion. It comes from something below thought, something that has decided this person represents a violation of how reality should function. Most blanks don't survive long enough to become a strategic problem. The social isolation is total. Communities that have no understanding of what they are experiencing react to the wrongness by removing its source. The Imperium, which has spent 10,000 years studying its own fear, responds differently. It finds these people early, classifies them as strategic assets, and begins harvesting them for programs that require exactly what they are. The pariah gene comes in grades. At the weakest expression, what the lore calls sigma level, the effect is a whisper, mild unease, the persistent sense that someone in the room shouldn't be there. At the omega level, the highest expression of the gene, the field reaches a different order of magnitude entirely. An omega-level blank can sever a psyker's connection to the warp completely, can banish manifested demons from material space simply by walking into their vicinity, can kill psychers at close range through the sheer disruptive force of their presence, with no hostile intent required. The Warhammer 40,000 wiki entry on blanks is direct. They possess no presence within the warp, making them immune to demonic possession and spiritual corruption by chaos forces. Demons can't see a blank. They can sometimes detect the hole a blank makes in their perception. A powerful enough warp entity, given sufficient reason to search, can infer the presence of a null by the shape of its displacement, a conspicuous empty space where sensation should exist. But there is a meaningful operational difference between reading a target and inferring that a target exists somewhere in a zone you can't perceive. In a war conducted partly through sorcerous intelligence, that difference reshapes every tactical calculation made against the force carrying it. The Imperium understood what it had in these people early enough to build permanent institutions around them. The Sisters of Silence are an all-blank military order, operational during the Great Crusade in the late 30th and early 31st millennia. When Roboute Guilliman faced Magnus the Red on Luna, Sisters of Silence were deployed specifically to dampen the Sorcerer King's psychic capabilities. Magnus, the most warp-saturated Primarch the Emperor built, a being whose psychic power bent reality passively around him, whose epithets include the Red Cyclops, the Sorcerer King, the Crimson King, had his abilities visibly degraded by the coordinated null presence of human blanks. The principle is documented and established at Primarch scale. It works against the strongest psychers the setting contains. The Calexis Temple recruits from the extreme end of the pariah spectrum. One of the 6 assassination orders of the Officio Assassinorum, it takes Omega-level children, subjects them to training the background literature describes as brutal even by Astartes standards, and produces what it calls Calexis assassins. The temple's location itself is classified beyond most Imperial access. Surviving lore describes it as a planet which orbits no sun and which is beyond the reach of normal Imperial space. The children who go there aren't returned. The temple's founding isn't documented in any surviving archive. The Calexis assassin's primary weapon, the animus speculum, converts the psychic energy drained from surrounding space by the blank's aura into directed, lethal blasts. It's purpose-engineered technology that interfaces directly with the null field mechanism, built by someone who understood how the pariah gene works at sufficient depth to design a control system for it. More importantly, the animus speculum includes a built-in dampening function that reduces the null field's intensity when stealth requires it. That detail, buried in equipment descriptions, is one of the most structurally significant facts in this argument. The field can be modulated. The on-off question isn't theoretical. The Imperium built the answer into standard equipment. Scale everything above to Primarch level. Then apply it to a war against chaos. The Emperor created exactly 20 Primarchs, each from his own genetic material, each commanding one of the first founding Space Marine legions numbered 1 through 20. 18 of those Primarchs have names, homeworlds, personalities documented across hundreds of pages of Horus Heresy fiction, and known fates. Legions 2 and 11 don't. The canonical language is exact. The missing Primarchs and their legions were deliberately removed from all Imperial records. The Warhammer 40,000 wiki describes them as subject to the Edict of Obliteration, an Imperial mechanism whose stated purpose is to preserve the honor of the Emperor by removing every trace of the person from the life of the Imperium, as if he had never existed. No name, no image, no homeworld, no battle honors, no gene seed lineage traced to any successor chapter. The lexiconum confirms the same phrasing from its end. Both legions listed as having been deleted from imperial records. Dan Abnett established the count in Horus Rising, published in 2006. The novel was the first in the Horus Heresy series, and it plants the pattern cleanly. Characters know the number was meant to be 20, acknowledge the two missing in the vaguest possible terms, and then close the subject down. No character pursues it, no name surfaces. Every subsequent Horus Heresy novel that approaches the topic repeats the same behavior. Awareness noted, topic abandoned, names never spoken. The authors are depicting people who were instructed to forget and who obey that instruction even in internal reflection. What never happens, in all of that literature, is mockery. The traitor Primarchs weaponize everything they can reach against their former brothers. Conrad Kurz arranges bodies as messages. Horus offers Loken a chance to serve again on different terms. Magnus sends his ghost across the void to warn the Emperor and destroys Prospero in the doing. The psychological cruelty in the Horus Heresy's literature is sophisticated and sustained. These are men who know their brothers intimately, who trained alongside them, who understand precisely which memories cause the most damage. In all of that vast archive of betrayal, no traitor Primarch has ever used the Lost Two, not as a taunt, not as a reference, not as the ghost of a wound to open in a difficult moment. Nothing. That silence is structural. You don't use a weapon you were ordered to forget exists. Compare this to the traitor Primarch's treatment in the record. Horus Lupercal drove a chaos-infused blade into the Emperor's body. He is in every archive. Fulgrim became a demon prince. Documented. Mortarion commands a plague fleet from the warp. Documented. Every traitor is in the record because the Imperium preserves infamy as deterrents. Their crimes function as warnings. Their names train the next generation in what loyalty costs when it fails. The 2nd and the 11th weren't preserved as warnings. They were removed as secrets. That is a categorically different operational logic. It implies a categorically different reason. One account, compiled from community lore rather than primary Black library text, and carrying that source's inherent uncertainty, holds that Rogel Dorn learned the nature of the missing Primarchs through Malcador the Sigillite and responded with fear. Not grief, not outrage, fear. Dorn, who fortified the Imperial Palace against Horus's entire armada with 18,000 Astartes, was frightened by the information itself. Failed experiments produce disappointment. Traitors produce prosecution. A specific category of secret produces fear, the kind where knowing the truth makes you vulnerable to whatever that truth contains. The lore community, across thousands of discussions, analytical essays, and lore videos, has assembled a structural observation about the Primarch family that Games Workshop has never formally confirmed. It isn't stated canon. No GW design document treats Primarch pairings as a defined schema, but the pattern surfaces consistently enough in independent analyses that it keeps being reconstructed from scratch by people who haven't read each other's conclusions. Look at the 20 Primarchs as a designed architecture, and certain complementarities emerge. Sanguinius and Conrad Kurz, both marked from birth, one defined by sacrifice and the other by his own prophesied death. The Lion and the Night Haunter, both raised in absolute darkness, diverging only in what they chose to do with it. Robute Gilliman and Alfarius, the legalist and the manipulator, order and its shadow. The family spans every extreme of human disposition, And when you map those extremes, a structural logic appears. The Emperor built toward every pole. Magnus the Red sits at the warp-saturated end of that spectrum, unique among his brothers in remembering his own creation. His epithets, the Red Cyclops, the Sorcerer King, the Crimson King, all point to the same truth. The most warp-integrated Primarch the Emperor built, whose legion fielded more sorcerers than any other force in the Great Crusade. His presence in the Imperium was immense, distinct, and readable from distances that most psychers couldn't reach. Community analysis of the mirrored architecture argues plainly. If the two missing Primarchs complete the family's design, one of them likely occupies the opposite position from Magnus. Not warp-saturated, but warp-absent. Not visible to every force in the Imperium, but invisible to them. Not a psyker, but the structural negation of one. A null. The second Primarch's gap sits in precisely that position in the family's numbering and in its logical architecture. Games Workshop's confirmation isn't available, but the structural argument holds independently of confirmation. If this family was built to represent every extreme, the absence at the warp-negative extreme is exactly where you would place a blank. And the blank reading does more than fit a structural pattern. It provides the answer that the structural argument can't supply by itself. It explains why the erasure happened at all, and why it took the form it did. Every documented case of chaos corruption in the Primarch family uses the same mechanism. Horus was corrupted through a warp ritual on Davin, his soul directly exposed to the Imperium at its most hostile. Fulgrim was possessed by a demon bound into a blade, which overwrote his warp soul from the inside. Magnus, Mortarion, Angron, each transformed through their psychic signatures, their reflections in the warp reshaped or consumed by chaos's influence. The vector is consistent across every case. Chaos interacts with a target's warp soul, finds the weakness, and enters through it. This isn't speculation. It's the documented mechanism across the entire Horus heresy. And canon is explicit about what it means for blanks. They possess no warp presence, making them immune to demonic possession and spiritual corruption by chaos forces. No soul in the medium, no weakness to locate. The demon blade has no anchor. The warp ritual carries no resonance it can redirect. The chaos god's whisper travels through a channel that simply does not function in this Primarch's vicinity. Every sun the Emperor built could be corrupted through their immaterial reflection. Magnus was. Horus was. Mortarion was transformed through warp soul corruption. The second Primarch, if the theory holds, was the one who fundamentally couldn't be, because the mechanism by which chaos operates does not exist in him. The combat applications follow directly from the canonical mechanics. Within his null field, psychic powers collapse on both sides, but in the Great Crusade's theater, the enemy fielded vastly more sorcery than the Imperium. Chaos warlords whose tactical edge rested on demonic support would find that support failing inside his operational radius. Summoning rituals would abort mid-rite, the calling unheard. The warp-driven capabilities that could turn a contained engagement into a rout. Demons manifesting behind Imperial lines, sorcerous artillery raining from impossible angles, would stop functioning as soon as he brought his legion into range. The battlefield geometry of every fight he entered would begin with the enemy's most dangerous assets already degraded. Tzeentch is the chaos god most defined by warp sorcery and the manipulation of possible futures. His power runs through the Imperium skeins, reading and redirecting currents of probability. A Primarch whose movements produce no warp trace, whose actions leave no recoverable signal in the medium Tzeentch uses to see, would be operationally difficult to track through prophetic means. Canon does not say that Tzeentch is literally blind to blanks. Powerful warp entities can detect a null as a conspicuous absence, an empty space in their perception where something should be. But there is a meaningful operational difference between reading a target directly and inferring that a target exists somewhere in a region you can't clearly perceive. In a war conducted partly through precognition, that difference affects every strategic plan drawn against the forces he commanded. The inference that follows from the mechanics without any specific canonical citation. If blanks diminish the warp's influence in the space around them, Tzeentch's most efficient workaround would be to influence the people near the blank rather than the blank himself. That observation tells you why a blank Primarch was uniquely valuable even against a god who sees. Even the architect of fate would be working at a structural disadvantage, forced to attack the edges of the formation rather than its center, unable to simply read the commander's intentions directly. Now the liabilities. The weapon had serious ones. An honest engagement with the theory requires naming them. The null field is indiscriminate. It does not distinguish between an enemy sorcerer and the Legion's own librarians. Within its radius, all warp-based activity suppresses, friend and foe alike. The second Primarch's own psychic assets would operate at severely degraded capacity near their commander. Navigators required for warp transit might find their sight compromised within the aura's reach. Long-range astropathic communication, the nervous system of Imperial logistics, would be unreliable anywhere in his immediate vicinity. The Legion would carry self-imposed psychic constraints that no other Legion bore. Deeper than that, every warrior in the Legion would feel wrong, every single day. The aversion field does not select targets. Each soldier standing near their Primarch would experience, below conscious thought, the pre-rational revulsion the pariah gene generates in all nearby humans, an inexplicable wrongness with no identifiable source, an urge to be somewhere else that recurs every time proximity is required. Across 100,000 Astartes, sustained across years of service, that pressure would erode the Brotherhood Space Marines require to function at peak effectiveness. The bond that makes a legion would be working against its own commanding force simply by existing near him. This is the central liability. It's also where the community's most careful theorizing about this topic concentrates. Under Inquisitor Romanov's 231,000-view video on the Lost Primarch's appearances across the lore, the single most liked theory comment earned 630 likes, the highest vote total of any theory comment on that video. It states, "The second was a very powerful blank, able to control his own null field, so his brothers wouldn't feel aversion to him. His censor was part of a larger gambit against chaos." 630 people had already half-assembled this argument in the comments of a general overview video. The demand isn't for someone to introduce the theory. It's for someone to hand them the completed version. Canon does not give us a blank who can fully disable their aura under conscious control alone. The field is described as innate and constant under normal circumstances, but Canon gives us modulation in two documented forms. The animus speculum includes a built-in dampening function that reduces null field output on operational demand, technology specifically designed to manage the field's intensity. At least one Sister of Silence reportedly possessed a pariah gene powerful and refined enough to direct her null presence with the precision to make herself effectively imperceptible even to custodians when she chose not to be noticed. a narrative hint toward trained focus rather than constant, uncontrolled broadcast in every direction. Background material on blank mechanics describes elite-level pariahs trained to narrow and concentrate their aura rather than radiating it uniformly. Complete switching off under conscious control alone remains unconfirmed. But field shaping, focusing the null effect forward, narrowing the rear radius, managing its intensity at social proximity, is consistent with the canonical evidence available. A Primarch-level being with the most intensive training the 30th millennium could offer, and access to whatever technology the Emperor could design for this specific purpose, might have achieved field management no ordinary pariah could approach. The controlled null field is the theory's most elegant element and its most honest extrapolation. Built from canonical precedents, clearly not stated in any primary text, and the only version of the theory that explains how this weapon could function at operational scale for years without destroying the legion it was supposed to lead. The second Primarch was reportedly discovered in 821 M30, among the earliest of the 20 found. He demonstrably led his legion long enough to generate a history requiring extensive and deliberate removal to eliminate. Broken weapons don't receive that level of operational investment. Duration argues function. Several competing theories attempt to explain the Second Legion's fate, and each deserves honest engagement before addressing what those theories can't explain. The Rangdan xenocide hypothesis is the most circumstantially supported alternative. 3 xenocidal campaigns fought against the xenos threat known as the Rangda in the late 800s M30, among the deadliest conflicts of the Great Crusade era. The Second Legion reportedly appears among 5 forces confirmed present via a single indirect reference in Imperial Guard unit orders, the only surviving document directly associating the Second Legion with any specific engagement. The timing fits the window when the Second disappeared. The scale of the xenocides provides a credible context for catastrophic loss. The problem is this. Ferrus Manus was decapitated at Istvan V. He has an entry in every relevant archive. Imperial heroes who die in battle are commemorated. The Rangdan theory explains why a Primarch might disappear from the front lines. It does not explain why that disappearance required eliminating the Primarch's name from every archive in the Imperium, rather than carving it into a memorial. Death produces monuments. Secrets produce erasure. The mechanism of removal applied to the Second isn't the mechanism used for honored dead. The Psyker catastrophe theory runs directly into the historical treatment of Magnus the Red. Magnus broke the Emperor's secret webway project with an unsanctioned psychic act, triggered the deliberate destruction of his home system, killed tens of thousands of his own legion at the hands of the wolves, and became a demon Primarch serving Tzeentch. Magnus isn't erased from the record. He is in the record. The Thousand Suns' fall is documented, named, and preserved as a warning about unchecked psychic power. The erasure applied to the lost Primarchs is more complete than anything Magnus received, which means whatever threat they represented was categorically different in kind from a rogue Psyker. The Imperium prosecutes and damns dangerous Psykers, and preserves the record of their damnation. It does not obliterate them. The Xenos Alliance theory explains punishment. It doesn't explain why that punishment took the form of total institutional amnesia rather than documented execution for heresy. Imperial commanders who advocate for Xenos interests appear in the archive as negative examples. Cautionary stories used in training to illustrate why the Imperial truth condemns exactly that sentiment. If the second Primarch argued for the humanity of alien life and paid for it with his life, his name would be in a text somewhere, teaching the next generation why that argument fails. The Xenos theory produces a named villain. The record contains no villain where the second should be. The gene seed failure theory fits the 11th Legion better than the second. One Horus heresy source describes one of the missing legions as never having progressed past an early alpha phase, approximately 1 to 2,000 Astartes, terminated before full development, cause listed as tainted. That describes a prototype that failed before deployment. The second demonstrably operated at sufficient scale and duration to generate the kind of institutional record that requires extensive, deliberate removal to eliminate. Prototypes that never function properly don't produce that volume of history. Every competing theory explains why a Primarch might be removed from command. None of them explains why the Emperor would apply the Edict of Obliteration, the mechanism that removes every trace of the person from the life of the Imperium, as if he had never existed, to cover that removal, and do so with a completeness exceeding anything applied to any traitor in the history of the Horus heresy. The blank theory supplies that logic. A secret weapon is only a weapon while it remains a secret. Classification creates a sealed file. Total obliteration destroys the file and erases the knowledge that a file ever existed. In most operational contexts, classification suffices. The problem specific to this setting is the nature of the enemy's intelligence capability. Tzeentch's power flows through the Imperium. His intelligence gathering operates through sorcery, through the possession of imperial operatives, through reading the psychic echoes that events leave in the warp's medium. Any secret that lives in a mind is potentially accessible through a possessed mind reading it. Any classified operation leaves warp traces that a sufficiently capable sorcerer can reconstruct. Tzeentch's foresight has practical limits. His plans fail often enough across the canon that omniscience is clearly not what he practices. But his intelligence gathering operates on a vector that conventional imperial security can't block. Classifying a document does not protect it from an adversary who can read it directly from the person holding it. The only information chaos can't find through those channels is information that does not exist anywhere reachable. Not classified, not sealed, gone. So completely that the absence generates no recoverable signal. Not even the psychic echo of something once known and then deliberately forgotten. The Emperor made brutal calculations. Every account of his nature in the lore converges on this quality. He saw consequence chains no mortal mind could trace, weighed outcomes across centuries, and acted on those calculations with cold precision. A son who worked perfectly was a son whose value, once his mission was complete, exceeded his continued existence as a known quantity by enough to justify the cost of his removal from memory. The erasure wasn't grief managed badly. It was the final step of an operational security protocol that began the moment the weapon was first deployed. He filed the victory somewhere no power in the universe could read the file. Now look at what remains. The Calexis Temple exists. Its location is classified beyond most imperial access, described in surviving background material as a planet which orbits no sun and which is beyond the reach of normal imperial space. This isn't metaphor. This is an institution so sensitive that its physical location is itself a secret. Its operatives are taken in childhood, subjected to training described in background literature as brutal even by assassinorum standards, and never returned. The temple's founding isn't documented in any archive that survives. Whoever designed its methodology left no name behind. The institution exists fully formed, its origins opaque, its purpose too sophisticated to have been improvised. The Sisters of Silence exist. Operational during the Great Crusade itself, their origins described in every canonical source that addresses them as shrouded in mystery. A fully developed institutional framework for deploying blanks as coordinated military assets, hierarchy, doctrine, recruitment networks spanning the galaxy, tactical protocols refined enough to visibly suppress a Primarch-level psyker in direct engagement. That level of development does not emerge organically. Doctrine at that sophistication requires a designer who understood the underlying mechanics deeply enough to build operational protocols around them. The Sisters of Silence require a blueprint. That blueprint's author is unnamed. The animus speculum exists, purpose-built technology that interfaces with the null field, weaponizes the psychic drain it produces, and incorporates a built-in dampening mode for operational flexibility. You don't design that device from first principles as a theoretical exercise. You design it when someone has already studied blank field mechanics at institutional depth sufficient to ask, how do we manage this field when management is necessary? And arrived at an engineered answer. The dampening mode implies prior knowledge of what the field does and how its intensity can be adjusted. That knowledge had to come from somewhere. None of these institutions names its architect. All of them were operational during the Great Crusade. The same era the Second Legion existed, functioned for years, and was then erased. Their founding documentation is either gone or was never committed to record. The convergence of timing, sophistication, and missing attribution is too precise to dismiss as coincidence. Whether it constitutes proof is a different question. The connection between the second Primarch and this infrastructure is inference, not canon. Games Workshop has confirmed nothing of the kind. The argument is structural. These institutions required a designer with knowledge of blank field mechanics at a depth implying prior study at a scale that exceeds anything a normal human pariah could provide. And the only figure in the Great Crusade era with that asset and that institutional reach was the Emperor, who, in this theory, had already deployed and then erased exactly such a figure. It's the most internally consistent explanation the evidence permits. It isn't the only possible explanation. The shape of what's missing matters. The second Primarch's records contain nothing recoverable. No name, no homeworld, no personality trait preserved in successor chapter culture, no gene seed lineage traceable in any Astartes formation, no cultural signature embedded in any legion that followed. Community research places his discovery at 821 M30, reportedly among the earliest Primarchs found, but that date comes from community compilation rather than primary text. The single confirmed trace of Legion activity is one indirect reference in Imperial Guard unit orders, placing the second among 5 forces at the Rangdan genocides. One document. Everything else is absent. Every other Primarch left traces that survive the erasure. Gene seed lineages in successor chapters. Cultural signatures embedded so deeply in Legion character that they persist even after the Codex reorganization that split the Legions apart. The second left a gap, a deliberate, precisely shaped gap, the exact dimensions of something once present and systematically removed at every level of institutional memory. That isn't how things go missing. That is how things are removed. Let me be clear about what this argument is and where it stops. Games Workshop has never confirmed the second Primarch's identity, nature, or fate. No canonical Black Library text names him as a blank. No codex establishes the Calexis Temple as his institutional inheritance. This is theory, built from canonical mechanics, structural pattern, and the internal consistency of the setting's logic. The blank reading competes with Rangdan, Psyker, Xenos, and gene seed theories, and none has received canonical resolution. Every one of them is inference reaching into the same absence. What the blank theory has that its competitors lack is an answer to the single question that distinguishes this erasure from every other event in Horus heresy history. Why obliterate rather than prosecute? Death earns a memorial. Failure earns a warning. Treason earns a record used to train the next generation. The chaos gods themselves, whose crimes are measured in annihilated worlds, whose names echo across 10,000 years of warfare, are documented, named, and catalogued, because naming them helps fight them. The Horus heresy, the worst betrayal in human history, is preserved in the archive because the warning is worth more than the shame of having it known. The only thing that gets obliterated, thoroughly, deliberately, at the cost of institutional memory that might have saved lives across 10 millennia, is a secret worth more kept than known. A weapon whose power depended entirely on the enemy not knowing it existed. The only erasure that makes operational sense rather than punitive sense. The Imperium spends a fortune in blood hunting blanks across the galaxy. It cages them, breaks them, and forges them into weapons against the warp, the Colexis, the Sisters of Silence, the warders on the black ships who keep psychers controlled during transit. It has understood what these people are and what they are worth for the entire duration of the long war. And the whole time, the greatest pariah it ever made sits at the bottom of a hole in its own memory. A Primarch the Chaos Gods can't see because the Emperor made sure no one could. He didn't lose the Second Legion. He won with it, once, and then he hid the victory so well that 10,000 years later, his own Imperium is fighting a war it already had the weapon to end and can't remember where it put it. Subscribe for more stories like this.